All right, welcome to Tuesday Night Theologetics. Glad you guys made it. We were having a fun conversation right before the lights came on. A couple announcements real quick. Let me start with that. First of all, the podcast is going and flowing. I would urge you to go to it because, we sit down and talk and film it, and it amazes me that it's that people listen to it, but it's great. So I recommend it. It's called A Lot of Words Podcast. It's on everything, I think, so go anywhere where podcasts are found. You go on YouTube, I don't even know the other places. You got Spotify and Apple, all those places are podcasts, A Lot of Words Podcast. Apparently, we did one on aliens, and so we get the alien people asking some questions, so we'll see how that works. We're doing some more filming for it. So, but yeah, check that out. I'm excited. And then the books, the first book coming out this year is the Mere Membership book. We're hopefully going to get our first copies in the next couple weeks, and so hopefully that'll be available for you guys. I'm really curious if you read it and like it. I think it's good. I think it's a necessary thing in the church, so I'm excited to see the reception from you guys. And then the Genesis Volume 1, Genesis So What Volume 1, I'm doing an editing process right now, but it's a lot, so it's going to be a couple months for sure, but the goal is to get that out. And I'm hoping this is well received. This will be like a 4-year project when it's all said and done. So if that goes well and is received well, that's going to give me sort of the green light to try to get the whole Pentateuch done, which would be exciting. And so if I have my way, by the time we finish Deuteronomy, I'll be well on my way to releasing Exodus. And so then the goal is to go back in the New Testament. I'm hoping Christ comes back before all that. But regardless, that's the exciting stuff. So that's some of the updates with the book stuff. Definitely go to the podcast if you haven't done it yet. Definitely go subscribe, ask questions. Any questions you have, it's sort of fitting our Q&A structure. So we used to do a Q&A every once in a while. So if you do the Q&A, Brett asks the questions. The premise of the podcast is more, I think what you guys would like, because you guys have been with me for a while. If I were to describe it, what I think is valuable is that it's basically imitating or illustrating what I would call like a proper Christian epistemology. And the reason I like that is that basically it's just a conversation, but the idea is that I don't know the subject really. And then Brett's asking me, so the idea is you want to get a hot take, but it's not trying to say funny things. It's like a hot take where you get to see sort of me work out the categories of answering a question in real time. And whether that's valuable or not, I think it actually probably is more valuable than we realize because we just don't have as many models of just thinking through things together kind of thing. So I think that's a fun thing to do. So check it out. Let's see what happens with it. And then again, with these books, pray for me. I'm excited about it. And then let's go through a small little debate we were having before the camera came on. So if you're watching and you feel free to comment in the comment section, let's try this one. We haven't done this yet. I was having a conversation with the guys, we were walking here, and I said, well, that was a really prescient idea. And they're like, what was that word? And I'm like, it's a normal word, prescient. So I'm just curious how many of you have heard of that word, and if you use it in a normal way, because I was essentially marginalized as a man from the 1890s simply for using a normal word in the normal language that is called English. In the comment section, if you can, go out of your way and tell us what you think. And then one more thing, because I'm going to just capitalize on this totally separate note. If hypothetically someone happened to want to order dress shirts on Amazon because they were running out of dress shirts that fit, what would be the best dress shirt brand that had an 18-inch neck and a shorter waist that fit nicely? Just put that in the comments as well, and perhaps I might go there. So with that, let me say a prayer and we'll jump into the book. So God, thanks so much for tonight. Thank you for the folks here and then just this book and for Lennox and for the prescience of getting to go through this book at this time as the culture's swinging this way very rapidly. We just praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. So backing that word, prescient, the idea is that we've been playing this book, looking back at something from 2007, which is called God's Undertaker. We're in chapter 6 tonight. And the goal of the book is really a rebuttal to Richard Dawkins' God Delusion, which came out in 2006. But it's 2026, so this is 20 years later that we're revisiting this debate. And so as I've talked about earlier at the beginning of this book, my point was the normal pendulum shift towards paganism that came when secularism tried to cut off the branch from sort of Reformation Christianity, okay, the Western presuppositions of Christianity. And so that pagan swing was not secular, it was actually very religious and superstitious. And so that's kind of where we are today. You saw the the religious kind of language and politics. And so the culture is going to likely swing back to a romanticized secularism, and in order to do that, they're going to look for sort of you're going to start to see a reinvigoration of things like atheism, evolution, which have kind of gone out of they're more passé today. You don't see the new atheists any longer, but they're going to start creeping up again. And when that happens, my main goal with going through Lennox was to kind of dunk on some of the bombast. There's another word. I'm not going to find all my words now. You just really made me self-conscious, Brett. But some of the overconfidence of guys like Dawkins and the rest, where they would speak in such a way that was just over the top, and they did it for shock value. But the things they said, again, I keep using the analogy, but it's like going back in the comment section of a UFC fight that's already happened, and sort of looking at all the guys that made the wrong prediction and making sure you point the finger a little bit. I want us to see that like the rhetoric of the new atheists was so overblown. It was not something we should be listening to, and we know this for a fact now, and it's important for us to see this now because my goal for you as Christians is that you can be calm, that you're not going to freak out when you see this language, that we can understand what the issues are, and that you're kind of ready. Again, typically in apologetics and thinking through apologetic issues, the church is always reactionary. We're actually talking about something 5-10 years later after the debate's moved on. My hope is that we can address some of these things because I do think the pendulum's swinging back this way. So Lennox does a great job. We've been talking about evolution, and the very idea that a Christian's talking about evolution in general, like the comments on the shorts that come up, all basically do the same thing. They make ad hominem attacks. Well, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, none of them address anything that's the normal it's par for the course for folks that kind of think in these terms. What we're asking, what Lennox is asking, are really modest questions. And as a Christian tonight, what we want to cover is the difference between the nature and the scope of the term evolution, because there's a little bit of a bait and switch going on, and if we don't understand it, there's this rhetorical flourish kind of defeats our position. And so what I mean by that is the main thing that Lennox is going to go through is that evolution, and when you define it, is used in various ways. But in the most specific sense, there's a difference between the observable thing that we can see, which is we would call that microevolution. The normal natural selection that we see is an observable, repeatable phenomenon. It is, no one should deny that. And so what we're debating is the mechanism of that change. We don't have any evidence that mechanism is the reason we have anything at all. That's not a scientific statement. That's a philosophical, metaphysical statement. But both are called evolution. And so the bait and switch game goes something like this. Oh, you're denying science? We know this is a settled thing. But they're talking about the lab, the things we can repeat. Well, we agree with them. What's not settled is the metaphysical idea that everything came through this mechanism. Does that make sense? That's the part that I'm like, yeah, what's science? It's not a scientific statement at all. But we get stuck because it kind of switches it up really quickly. So let's go through Lennox's point. It's a very subtle point. It's nice. Anybody that's a good scientist would always like clarity, and clarity is a good thing. So thus far, we've been using the term evolution as if it had a single agreed meaning. But this is manifestly not the case. Discussion of evolution is frequently confused by failure to recognize that the term is used in several different ways, some of which are so completely non-controversial that rejection of them might indeed evidence some kind of ignorance or stupidity, but even then, scarcely wickedness. So what then is evolution? And so, again, let me remind you that John Lennox is a mathematician. He's a precise thinker. His arguments are modest in this chapter. But let's go through it. The first way evolution is used is just a term that means change or variation. So here, the word's used to describe change without really any implication for like the kind of mechanism or intelligent input or lack thereof that involved in bringing about the change. So we might say, the evolution of the motor car, right? The evolution of cinema, the evolution of things. None of us are thinking that this was sort of the word we're using it in such a way that means change. So in the context, if we have any grammarians in here, then English people, right? It's like the way we would be using the word evolution that way would just mean change, right? So great. So who denies change? We like that. We would say, the evolution of life. They mean that life arose and is developed by whatever means, and it's kind of a neutral, innocuous, uncontroversial term. So then the second way evolution is used is more precise, and this is the way that I think I would use it when I say I believe in evolution in this sense, which is microevolution. One way to describe it, which is variation within prescribed limits of complexity, quantitative variation of already existing organs or structure. Such processes were observed by Darwin in connection with the Galapagos finch species. And this aspect of the theory is scarcely controversial, as such effects of natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, etc., are constantly being recorded. One classic example with which we're sadly all too familiar right now around the world is the way in which bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics, like MRSA. As a jiu-jitsu guy, MRSA is the boogeyman, right? So staph infections are bad, and then the resistant staph infections are not good, and those things can happen. That's an evolutionary sort of adaptive change because we're overusing antibiotics and whatnot. So I think the idea of what he's saying, before we go into it, is that one of the things you'll find is that this term, microevolution, is almost a truism, because what Darwin's really saying it's a discovery that's so basic. We're like, things change when you add, nobody denies that. Nobody denies that. So it's worth recording that changes in the average finch beak length, for example, which had been observed during the drought period of 1977, were reversed during the rains of 1983. So that this research is more of an illustration of cyclical change due to natural selection than it is of permanent improvement or even change. And this reversal, however, is not always mentioned in the textbooks. In other words, what Darwin was trying to posit was that there's a mechanism, which natural selection is a mechanism which gives us sort of a forward-moving change in some sense that ultimately leads to the complexity of life. There's a sort of a creative aspect to this mechanism. And so the observed mechanism itself is not controversial. No one debates it. But it's fascinating because in statistics, so we've talked about English, let's talk about statistics. And I don't mean statistics as in you like numbers, but my least favorite classes in my psych major as an undergrad was statistics. It's the worst subject in the world. If you like statistics, God help you. However, one of the things about statistics, there's a couple things that are fascinating. One is this term, this idea of regression towards the mean. In other words, the whole point of natural selection is such an obvious point, but it's the idea that the certain environment kind of affects the thing. So in other words, if you had all the dogs that we had, all the various, you take the little tiny wiener dog and the giant, Great Danes, and you put a bunch of wiener dogs and Great Danes and everything in the middle, and you put them in a zoo house for a little while, you're gonna get a dog that comes out that looks like Plato's dog. You're gonna get a mutt. You're gonna get the doggiest dog. You're gonna get a normal dog. It's a regression towards the mean. And this is kind of true in general. You're gonna regress towards the kind. This is true for people. This is true for all sorts of stuff. We're all sort of mutts in one way. And that's kind of the other direction of things. The way evolution is kind of posited is that sort of there's this constant permanence to each change, which, again, isn't true. But one of the main studies has been copied from textbook to textbook, and this is really interesting if you look it up, and it's been heralded as one of the main proofs of evolution, which is the occurrence of the industrial melanism in the peppered moth. How many of you remember I was a public school kid, and so I had this in my textbook, and so when I taught this book years ago, 20 years ago, we had people bring in textbooks. They had it in their textbook. Does anyone remember the story of the peppered moth? Anyone here remember that with their hands up? Oh, wow, okay. The claim, basically, is they'll show a tree, and if you look at the tree, they'll show a moth that's white on the tree. And they'll show another tree in another picture, and they're black and white pictures anyways, and the next tree, you can't see the moth because the moth has the same color as the trunk. And so the idea is that, so here's the way it goes, right? The claim is that natural selection produced a variation of the relative numbers of light moths to dark moths in the population. Light moths were more easily seen by predators than dark ones against the dark polluted surface of the tree's trunks, and so eventually the population would become dominated by dark moths, and this largely was because of pollution. So environmental change caused an adaptation in these moths. You guys remember this? It's kind of the basic story. Of course, if the account were true, and it is not, it would at best only be an example of microevolution or adaptation, and that only in the sense of cyclical change. No new moths were created in the process since both kinds existed already. Therefore, it wouldn't be controversial except insofar as examples of microevolution are frequently cited as sufficient evidence for macroevolution. So again, there's nothing controversial of saying, hey, check out this mechanism. That's not controversial, wow, that's interesting, right? We could say, and this is true for people. This is true for the colors of our skin. This is true for our heights. This is true for all sorts of factors, right? The size of our nose, whatever, how much hair on our body. These things can change. But what's interesting is when we say that mechanism that we're observing explains everything. That second statement isn't scientific. That's what I'm trying to get to again. However, here's the thing about the moth that's fascinating. According to Michael Majerus, a Cambridge expert on moths, the basic peppered moth story is wrong, inaccurate, or incomplete with respect to most of the story's component parts. In addition, there appears to be no evidence that peppered moths actually rest on tree trunks in the wild at all. In fact, the photographs in the textbooks that showed them to do so happened because someone actually taped dead moths to the tree trunks for the photos. They've admitted to it. This isn't a controversy. It's known. In the Times Higher Educational Supplement, biologist Lynn Margulis is puzzled by the fact that Steve Jones is still using the peppered moth in his book as he updates and talks about Darwin, entitled Almost Like a Whale, even though, according to her, they know that that story isn't true. In other words, when they're confronted, they say, hey, the moth story isn't true, it was fake. They say, yeah, but it still illustrates the principle enough so they keep using it. Again, I want to make this really clear. I'm not arguing that the premise that they're arguing isn't real. What I'm arguing is the fact that the story is the just so story to illustrate it, it's building a mythology of certainty, and I just think that's a challenge here, right? I mean, which leads us to really the big issue is macroevolution. And we're going to get into it later, which is what's called like biogenesis or abiogenesis, which is how everything was made. That's next week in particular. But tonight we're getting to the mechanism itself. And my whole point tonight is, again, the mechanism of microevolution that we can see, adaptation through natural selection, all these things, totally legit. Macroevolution is to say that that mechanism can bear the weight of the creative process of everything we have. You have to see the difference of those two things. One is very immodest. So macroevolution refers to large-scale innovation, the coming into existence of new organs, structures, body plans of qualitatively new genetic material, for example, the evolution of multicellular from single-celled structures. Macroevolution thus involves a marked increase in complexity. This isn't being funny. This is basic. The distinction between micro and macroevolution is a subject of considerable dispute. And I want to make this really clear because the gradualist thesis, gradualists are Dawkins, it's the God delusion guys, they're gradualists. And what's fascinating about new atheists is this, they actually aren't the normal evolutionists that were popular before they became popular. In other words, if you watch the study of evolution that's been going forward, we're going to find out a little bit of this in a minute. Gradualists were the first guys after Darwin, right? They were all kind of gradualists. And then what we found out with we started at the cellular level, and we started looking at things, we realized that because of complexity, the mechanism itself just didn't explain that you had certain irreducibly complex changes that had to happen. And so you hear the normal examples, but the giraffe can't gradually develop one bit at a time the thing that shunts blood from going to its brain when it lowers its head. In other words, when a giraffe goes and it lowers its head to eat, there's a thing that stops the blood from flowing to its head once its neck reaches a certain point, because otherwise it would have an aneurysm every time it broke down. Every giraffe would die. So you don't gradually have a long neck and gradually develop that. You have to have both kind of at the same time, you know? This irreducible complexity is true for a lot of things. There's all sorts of animals. Like the normal idea about the gradualists weren't lost popularity was take the story of like the squirrel that became the flying squirrel, which became the flying bat or whatever, how the story is told. Eventually, and I'll just use my own analogy so if someone's watching on the YouTube or something like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, I'm making up an analogy just like the moth thing. So, okay, let's play the game. So imagine the story goes like this. Here's a squirrel, and it wants to get nuts, and some squirrels have a big thing between their toe and the webbing between their toe, and those squirrels keep getting the other squirrels, the girl squirrels, and so they keep mating more because I guess they like how that looks, and eventually that gets bigger and bigger, and then it becomes wings and it can fly. So then you go, see, squirrel like this, but it can't catch the other thing because it can't fly to that branch. So the ones that could would be, but here's the problem. Evolution is gradual. The gradualist view is that happens gradually over generations through natural selection. The problem with gradualism is at some point you have an intermediary, we're not even talking about new species. We're talking about an intermediary moment where you have some sort of disabled half squirrel bat thing that can't fly and can't run, and that's supposed to be getting all the girls. Like this, you know what gets all the girls is the squirreliest squirrel, not the one that's like deformed with a toe that can't fly. The gradualist view doesn't work, in other words. And so they had a view that was called punctuated evolution, which is the idea that rapid change happened all at once. And there's something to that view, right? But the point about the gradualists is that the idea that there's a difference between micro and macroevolution, they argue it because they're saying microevolution is macroevolution just taken to its logical extreme. That's their basic point. But even within this theory of Darwinists, like a lot of Darwinists are not gradualists. They would say that there's a massive difference between microevolution and macroevolution. That's why they believe this other thing. So it's just the idea that everyone's on the same side of things is kind of similar when people say the Catholic Church has like one doctrine when there's really like all these camps within the Catholic Church. It's just it's not true. So let's get to the next part here. Are you guys all following what I'm saying? All right. So just okay. Artificial selection, for example, in plants and animal breedings. We know this. That's another way evolution is talking about with like it's artificial. You can make plants get different by doing things to them. I don't know how that works with plants. So it's just seed stuff, right? Okay. And then with dogs, you know that, right? You can make your dog shows. You inbreed certain dogs to make them look a certain way. You don't want your pug to have a long nose. Like you want your pug to look the most puggy pug there is, so you only mate it with other pugs. Then you have like molecular evolution. This is another idea about mutating replicators. But again, the term evolution is just covering how these things happen. But Neo-Darwinian synthesis kind of uses natural selection at that level as well. But again, the point I'm trying to make is in light of the ambiguities of the meaning of the term evolution, Dawkins and Lewontin's accusations become more understandable. And this is helpful. We don't want to straw man the other position. We want to understand where they're coming from. To them, the way they framed it, now it's not a true framing, but the way they're framing it is that if questioning evolution means questioning evolution in the senses of 1, 2, and 4, which would be the general sense that things change over time, microevolution, like that, if it's questioning that, then yeah, that sounds stupid and ignorant, right? But that's what we already said. But if someone seriously doubts the validity of macroevolution, and we say, hey, I'm having a hard time there, that's a different subject entirely. That's a shell game now, trying to get us to see the difference. Confusion can arise, particularly when evolution is defined as microevolution. And so there's different people that talk about it, but this one guy named Wilson describes these things, and he just conflates them. There's a great example in the book, but in his example, it's mainly just a description of microevolution, and then he says, which is evidence for macroevolution. He just kind of says it, and that's kind of you see all the way through. Wilson completely bypasses the question as to whether the mechanism that we're observing can actually bear the extra weight that's put upon it in any full-blown understanding of evolution. And this is the most modest way to say this to somebody that's playing the I'm smarter than you game. And again, it should be a nice way to say it. We want to be kind to people. You're not talking to enemies. You're talking to people and wanting to build a bridge. And you're not saying, hey, I don't believe in science. You're saying, I don't think that science says what you're saying. That's a helpful thing because we live in the real world that God made, and so science is on our side. It's a friend of us. And so their view is something that the science is not pointing to. If they're positing, they're making a guesstimate, if that's the best word, they're making their position stated that this mechanism is what explains everything. In other words, they say everything looks designed. It's not designed because this mechanism accounts for all the things that look designed. And our comment is everything looks designed maybe because it is. And so that obviously certainly can be a good thing. But what they'll say is, no, we can observe under a microscope, so it's already a settled thing. I'm like, this is getting irritating. So, for example, answering the question, where did the birds come from in the first place, is really the big question we're trying to get to, right? He claims elsewhere in his article that natural selection does bear that weight. They'll say it does. They understand what I'm saying. They say, yeah, it does bear the weight. For instance, he says, quote, all biological processes arose through the evolution of these physiochemical systems through natural selection. Or again, humans are, quote, descended from animals by the same blind force that created those animals. Again, he can't stop using anthropomorphic language of created, but whatever. Furthermore, it's been repeatedly noted that at the level discussed in the definitions we just talked about, natural selection itself is essentially a self-evident process, right? Colin Patterson, FRS, in a standard text on evolution, presents it in the form of the following deductive argument. Point 1, all organisms must reproduce. 2, all organisms exhibit hereditary variations. True. Hereditary variations differ in their effect on reproduction. True. Therefore, Variations with favorable effects on reproduction will succeed. Those with unfavorable effects will fail, and all organisms will change. This is the observed phenomenon. Do you guys all follow what I just said? This is it. This is what it is. Thus, natural selection is a description of the process by which the strain in a population that produces the weaker progeny eventually gets weeded out, leaving the stronger to thrive. Patterson argues that formulated this way, natural selection is, strictly speaking, not even a scientific theory, but a truism. That is to say, it is true in the stating of it. You don't have to observe it to say it's true. This is a basic true statement logically. Now, that doesn't mean you can't observe that truism under a microscope or throughout periods, but that's what the whole point is. It is an uncontroversial, observable thing. No Christian should disagree with this thing. And we do a disservice to our position. We say, nuh-uh. Right? That's kind of what we're trying to say. Patterson's description, though he says, thus if we grant the first 3 points, the fourth point follows a matter of logic. It's an argument similarly advanced by Darwin himself. That's how Darwin made the argument in Origin of Species, nonetheless. But Patterson's description highlights something very easily overlooked, namely the fact that natural selection is not creative. Listen carefully. As he says, it is, quote, a weeding out process that leaves the stronger progeny. But the stronger progeny must already be there in the definition we just said. It is not produced by natural selection. Indeed, the very word selection ought to alert our attention to this. Selection is made from an already existing entity. Does that make sense? Like the whole premise of natural selection assumes something to select. So the fact that we kind of keep using this as a stand-in for a creative process should tell you where sort of the magic, the abracadabra is happening. And my whole point I'm making tonight is Dawkins would accuse Christians of ascribing to a God of the gaps theory, which is, first of all, nonsense. But if there was a God of the gaps, it's the evolutionist calling it an evolution of the gaps. They just don't know what it is. They're saying it's evolution. But regardless, it's an exceedingly important point because the words natural selection are often used as if they were describing a creative process. For instance, they capitalize the initial letters, natural selection with a capital N, like as if it's a person. It's highly misleading as we can see, and it goes into this a little bit. But one quote from Gerd Müller, an expert on Evo Devo, which is an increasingly influential, I just love the name. Evo Devo is an increasingly influential theory integrating evolutionary theory and developmental biology that's aiming to fill in some of the gaps in standard neo-Darwinism. So this guy's on the side of Dawkins, if you will. And he says this, in the neo-Darwinian world, the motive factor of morphological change is natural selection, which can account for the modification and loss of parts. But selection has no innovative capacity. It eliminates or maintains what exists. The generative and ordering aspects of morphological evolution are thus absent from evolutionary theory in every sense. So this is not a Christian saying this. Mueller thus confirms what logic and even language would tell us. Natural selection by its very nature does not create novelty. This flatly contradicts Richard Dawkins' bold assertion cited earlier that natural selection accounts for the form and existence of all living things. Such polar opposition of views on the central thesis of neo-Darwinism raises disturbing questions as to the solidity of its scientific basis and prompts us to explore a bit further. So again, let's be modest here. None of this is trying to say checkmate. We're trying to say, hey, your claims cannot bear the weight that you're putting on them. That's a very modest thing to say. It's a reasonable thing to say. Let me go a little bit further. All right. Although some biologists resist differentiating between microevolution and macroevolution, the terms are often used to distinguish, roughly speaking, between evolution below and beyond species level. There being debate on just where the line should be drawn. In other words, where does microevolution become what they're describing as macroevolution? So the idea is often termed, like I call it speciation. In other words, you can get all different kinds of cats, but a cat doesn't become a pig. That's speciation. In fact, what we find is the morphological term kind that's used in the Bible is one of the most helpful terms used in studying evolution within kind. It's actually a really helpful thing. But resistance to the distinction that we're talking about often arises because the evolutionary process is regarded as a seamless whole. That macroevolution is just simply what results from microevolutionary processes operating over long periods of time. Again, the statement that these small changes will just keep going into stratospheric new things that we just haven't observed yet. This view of the gradualists like Dawkins and Dennett is what I've been describing, and it begs the key question as to whether evolution really is a seamless whole or not. Whether, for example, the selection mechanisms, which we can reasonably say accounts for variations in the finch beak length, so the development of antibiotic resistance in bacteria, we're saying that that mechanism can account for the existence of finches in the first place. I don't know how we made that jump. In other words, the key question is there an edge to evolution, microevolution? The statement that exemplifies the value of the distinction between micro and macro evolution is made by a guy named Paul Wesson. Quote, large evolutionary innovations are not well understood. None has ever been observed. And we have no idea whether any may be in progress, and there is no good fossil record of any. By contrast, microevolutionary variations due to mutation and natural selection have been and are observed every single day. So this is a big statement, and it's a modest statement. So that when Dawkins himself says about God, he says, if you make a big statement about God, you need big evidence. And first of all, we're making a reasonable statement about God. You know, we don't need more evidence than what we have in the Gospels. You can accept it or not. If you win the lottery, I don't need extra size. Because the lottery is a lot of money, doesn't mean I need extra size evidence. I just have a lottery ticket, the same ticket I'd have for a $5 win or a $1 billion win. The ticket's the ticket. The evidence is the evidence. It's sort of a fallacy. But regardless, Dawkins himself says, no, if you make a big claim, you need huge evidence. He's making a huge claim with no evidence. It's just an assertion. The problem is clearly that extrapolating from observed to unobserved is fraught with danger, right? S.F. Gibbard and J.M. Opitz and R.A. Raff maintain that, quote, microevolution looks at adaptations that concern only the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. As Goodwin points out, quote, the origin of species, Darwin's problem, remains unsolved, unquote. Thus echoing the verdict of geneticist Richard Goldschmidt, quote, the facts of microevolution do not suffice for an understanding of macroevolution. So these guys would be non-creationists, non-Christians who vehemently disagree with Dawkins' entire premise. But you wouldn't know that. When you read The God Delusion, you have the impression that the scientific community is standing behind this guy who's truly out on a limb. Convinced Darwinist John Maynard Smith and E. Sazathmary take a similar line, quote, there is no theoretical reason that would permit us to expect that evolutionary lines would increase in complexity with time. There is also no empirical evidence that this happens. None. Sigrid Schroer of the Technical University in Munich suggests that living things can be classified in certain basic types, a classification slightly broader than that of species. And so he goes in and describes the basic thing we've been saying, but it describes what we've been talking about. Such comments lend weight to the view of biologist and philosopher Paul Ehrlich, quote, the mutation selection mechanism is an optimization mechanism. That is, it enables an already existing living system to adapt selectively to changing environmental conditions, much in the same way as genetic algorithms facilitate optimization and engineering. It does not, however, create anything radically new. So, and this is just the basic premise. You say, well, why is it that, people that live in a climate where the sun is always shining brightly would have darker skin? We're like, well, you probably would do better without sunscreen in that case. It makes sense. Why would we say that the tree, like whatever's helping those people to breed and exist, whatever's helping that animal to breed and exist, whatever's helping that plant to continue to propagate would be the one that keeps propagating, right? That's the point in view. This is, again, a truism. This isn't controversial at all. One eminent biologist whose research convinced him that there was a limit to what mutation natural selection could do, and so led him to reject neo-Darwinism, was a guy named Pierre Grassi of the Sorbonne in Paris, who was president of the Académie Française and editor of the definitive 28-volume work Traité des zoologies. The great geneticist Theodosius, I like this name. That's a good boy name, Theodosius. The great geneticist Theodosius Domzahansky held Grassi in high esteem. Quote, now one can disagree with Grassi but not ignore him. His knowledge of the living world is encyclopedic. He describes Grassi's book, L'Évolution des Vivants, as a, quote, frontal attack on all kinds of Darwinism. Its purpose is to, quote, destroy the myth of evolution as a simple, understood, and explained phenomenon, unquote, and to show that evolution is a mystery about which little is and perhaps can be known, when he talks about macro in that sense. In his book, Grassi observed that the fruit flies, this is really fascinating. So you've all heard the example of fruit flies. Why are fruit flies helpful for the study of evolution? Because they die super quick, right? They live for what, an hour? How long do fruit flies live? Like an hour? You guys, come on, no one knows? You guys don't know what prescient means, but you do know fruit flies. Come on, tell me. Someone Google it. Tell me, how long does a fruit fly live for? Just do it really quick. Let's try this. If Joe Rogan could do it, we can do it. So how long does a fruit fly live for? Do I have to do it? No one's trying it? What do we got? How long does a fruit fly live for? 40 to 50 days. Thank you so much. That took a long time. All right, so 40 to 50 days. So you can do a lot of generations of fruit flies in 40 to 50 days. You know what I'm saying? Like that's so you can have them, you can see variation. What's fascinating is, in his book, Rossi observed that fruit flies remain fruit flies in spite of thousands of generations that have been bred and all the mutations that have been induced in them. In fact, the capacity for variation, this is interesting, the capacity for variation in the gene pool seems to run out quite early on in the process, a phenomenon called genetic homeostasis. So in other words, they're constantly changing the environment to produce change, but you kind of reach a limit. It's like if you're building a character in a video game, there's only so many options you can do before you sort of run out of hairstyles and things you can do. More recent work on the E. coli bacterium backs this up, not what you get from Wendy's, but when they study it in a lab. Nothing's wrong with E. coli at Wendy's. No Wendy's, E. coli, I mean. Sponsored by Wendy's, just here. In this research, no real innovative changes were observed through 25,000 generations of E. coli bacteria. In other words, biochemist Michael Behe points out, and some people don't like Behe, so I'm not going to follow him very far because he's one of the guys that first wrote about intelligent design. He's not a Christian that I know of. Maybe he is, I don't know. But biochemist Michael Behe points out that now more than 30,000 generations of E. coli have been studied, equivalent to about 1 million human years. And the net result is that evolution has produced mostly devolution. Things got less awesome. Although some marginal details of some systems did change during the 30,000 generations, the bacterium has repeatedly thrown away chunks of its genetic patrimony, including the ability to make some of the building blocks of RNA. Apparently, throwing away sophisticated but costly molecular machinery saves the bacterium energy. Nothing of remotely similar elegance has been built. The lesson of E. coli is that it's easier for evolution to break things than to make things. And that's kind of a great statement. But I want to deal with briefly before we go on mathematics, because mathematicians and biologists have had a very interesting relationship over the years, precisely because, remember, the black box that is given to us in sort of macroevolution is if you take the mechanism, and that's what I'm trying to say, take the mechanism we can observe that we call microevolution, take that mechanism, and we say, well, how do I get, like, there's a video I watched in college. I rented it. I wasn't a believer. I got a bottle of wine, and I got this video. And it was a fun time. And it was about how the world was made. It was one of those, like, with the guy's accent on things. He's like, check out the sea cow. Like that guy. I don't know if it's that guy, but it's one guy. And it showed, like, a shark swimming and a monkey coming from the shark. I was like, there's a whole thing. I was like, and I was tripping out. I was at UC Santa Barbara, like, whoa. Whoa, that's crazy. And then when I became a Christian, I started looking and like, what in the world is that? I can't find it again. It was amazing. I just want to find it. It had to be ironic or something. But the point is, if you take the element of microevolution and you just say, how does that mechanism produce something? They say, well, just put it in this box called time. It's a black box. And so the reason that box works is if they say, well, how much time? I just say, abracadabra, so much time that you can't even know. So all of a sudden, this becomes mathematicians get interested here. Because now you're starting to make calculations. Well, time out. If more than 1 million years doesn't produce more fruit flies, what about 1 billion trillion? Like, mathematicians can start getting into statistics and the things that I hate. Nothing wrong with mathematicians. I don't hate mathematicians, just statistics. Mathematicians are becoming increasingly interested in biology, especially since the revolution in molecular biology. Mathematical biology has become a burgeoning discipline. One of the first significant attempts at high-level debate between a group of eminent biologists and mathematicians who were interested in biology took place at this place called the Wistar Institute in Philly in 1966. And so they had this big debate, okay? And an attempt to quantify the probabilities of the likelihood of a gradualist view of evolution by the accumulation of micromutations led to a fascinating interchange between mathematician Stanley Ulam and biologist Sir Peter Medawar, and the chairman of the conference, C.H. Waddington. These guys' names are so great. I haven't seen a Matt Smith yet, but I'm sure there's one of them. Ulam argued on the basis of his mathematical calculations that it was highly improbable that the eye could have evolved by numerous small mutational changes since the available time was simply not available. In other words, he's saying that the chances for this to happen are like 1 to the 10 to the millionth power, like whatever it is. He's like, you're telling me this is the case, and they just say abracadabra, black box. Or now multiverse, there has to be a universe where that has. Same idea, but Peter Medwar's replied this way, quote, I think the way that you have treated this is a curious inversion of what would normally be a scientific process of reasoning. It is indeed a fact that the eye has evolved, and that, as Waddington says, shows that this is, Ulam's formula is, I think, a mistaken one. That was their comment. And it's astonishing when you listen to it because it's very revealing. It's surely a, quote, curious inversion of the normal scientific process to assume the truth of what you want to prove, and on that basis discredit evidence that's brought against it. Like imagine that happening during Galileo's time. Well, that's an interesting study, but we already know that everything revolves around the world. And so since we know that, your study doesn't work. Like that's what they basically said. He just asserted, well, since we know that it was already evolved, he's like, I don't think we do. That's literally what we're debating. What the interchange showed was that for the biologists present, there could be no question of the mathematical evidence, even getting them to consider that there might be flaws in their assumptions. Ulam's calculations were supported by Marcel Paul Schutzenberger, a professor of mathematics from Paris and a member of the French Academy of Sciences. He objected to what he considered to be the too easy acceptance of evolution on the part of the biologists and was challenged by Waddington. Quote, your argument is simply that life must have come about by special creation. To which Schutzenberger, along with a number of others, cried, no. The two things are clear from this interchange. Listen to this carefully. Firstly, the mathematicians were not talking about creationism. They're talking about math. But the accusation against them for saying and questioning evolution was, well, you must be a creationist. And like, what are you talking about? Understanding they were trying to, that's what marginalization is. You're just saying, well, this is off limits. And these guys weren't creationists. They're like, what are you talking about? Astrophysicist and mathematician Sir Fred Hoyle did some calculations that led him also to doubt the validity of extrapolating from micro to macroevolution. He goes on. He says this, his conclusion to his mathematical arguments is characteristically blunt, quote, well, as common sense would suggest, the Darwinian theory is correct in the small, but not in the large. Rabbits come from other slightly different rabbits, not from either primeval soup or potatoes. Where they come from in the first place is a problem yet to be solved, like much of a cosmic scale. Hoyle then rejected the assertion too. He did not believe that evolution accounts for the existence of all life's complexity, nor should he have. Now, he gets into the fossil record here, and I don't want to get into it too much except to say that we just don't have anything in the fossil record that gives us any indication that gradualism is true. If you doubt that, if someone doubts what I'm saying, I'm sure you can go find your websites that are trying to tell you what you think they're true. Like if you're actually like honest and earnest, the fossil record just defeats microevolution. In fact, it was paleontologists that actually were the first ones to really bring up punctuated evolution, because that's the only way to account for the fossil record not having transitional species. And so some of the quotes that we have from paleontologists are like, look, the fossil record does not show what Darwin said it would need to show. It clearly doesn't. What did Darwin write in The Origin of Species? He said that, quote, the number of intermediate varieties which have formally existed on Earth should be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation, every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such graduated organic chain. This is perhaps the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Darwin himself said this. Zoologist Mark Ridley comments on the situation, quote, the fossil record of evolutionary change within a single evolutionary lineage is very poor. If evolution is true, species originate through changes of ancestral species. One might expect to be able to see this in the fossil record. In fact, it can be rarely seen, if at all. In 1859, Darwin could not cite a single example. All right, but it's been a long time since 1859. What about now? Well, paleontologist David Raup of the Field Museum of Natural History, which houses one of the largest fossil collections in the world, has said, quote, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded, and we now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have actually fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we actually had in Darwin's time, because what they thought was a transitional species turned out to not be the case. So it actually went backwards. In fact, Eldridge is another guy who makes an astonishing admission. He said, quote, we paleontologists have said that the history of life supports the story of gradual adaptive change, knowing all the while it does not. He says, like, we've supported this. The question is why? What conceivable reason could there be for members of an academic community to suppress what they know to be true? Unless it was something which supported a worldview which they'd already decided was unacceptable. And that's really what's going on. And that's my whole point to you right now. When we're talking to somebody about evolution, I want you to remind yourself it doesn't matter about evolution. What matters is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the problem is, evolution, as the mythologizing of evolution has created a plausibility structure that allows them to reject even listening to it. They can say the science has settled everything we have, evolution explains it. If you can pop that bubble and say, look, I'm not telling you that microevolution can't be observed. I'm saying the mechanism that you're saying, we just don't have any evidence for it. You're not trying to, that doesn't make someone a Christian. You're just saying, you're creating a plausibility structure where someone's willing to listen to the gospel with a mind to think that it possibly could be true. Not that they believe it, but they're willing to say that, well, okay. But once you say, oh, that fairy tale, I'm like, okay, if you say that from the start, that's the whole point. That's the idea of putting the pebble in the shoe. You're not trying to break everything down. You're trying to pop the bubble, the mist that gives these folks a sense that their view is scientific and solid. Once you say it's not, they're in the same boat as you. They have to play their hand just like you. And we have to see which view actually holds out in the real world. But what does the fossil record actually reveal? Gould wrote, it tells us something very important. It tells us about stasis. First of all, most species don't have any change at all. That's what the fossil record says. Secondly, it tells us that sudden appearance in any local area doesn't come gradually, but all at once. And so again, these guys are the ones that talked about the sudden appearance as maybe macroevolutionary jumps rather than just things moving to a different location. Punctuated equilibrium is the view that we're talking about. But let me go back. They said, this is a guy, a verdict, he says it's so, where am I at here? He says, they simply assert, Niles Eldrick, here it is, accused them of being weak on paleontology, the gradualists like Dawkins. So this is one evolutionist accusing another. And he says, they simply assert that evolutionary history is the outcome of natural selection working on available genetic variation. In other words, they simply extrapolate from what they observe in the present backwards through geological time, and that, Eldridge continues, to my paleontological eyes, thank you very much, is just not good enough. In other words, he's like, the evidence for what you're claiming doesn't fly. Simple extrapolation does not work. I found that out back in the 60s as I tried in vain to document examples of the kind of slow directional change we all thought ought to be there ever since Darwin told us that natural selection should leave precisely such telltale signal. I found instead that once species appear in the fossil record, they tend not to change very much at all. Species remain imperturbably, implacably resistant to change as a matter of course the entire time. The verdict, which is so strikingly at odds with the popular understanding of fossils, is supported by Colin Patterson, FRS. He says this, quote, I will lay it all on the line. There is not one such fossil, a fossil which is ancestral or transitional, for which one could make a watertight argument. It is additionally interesting that Patterson said this in connection with Archaeopteryx, whose fossilized remains were actually under his care in the Natural History Museum, and which at the time was often cited as an example of a transitional species between reptiles and birds. In other words, at his museum was the best example that the gradualists were saying was a transitional species, and the guy that was in charge of caring for that says there is no evidence for that. It's fascinating. All right, we're almost done here. So what shall those of us who are not experts in the field make of the fossil record? Well, surely the fact that such leading thinkers as those we cited are publicly expressing concerns about the foundational aspects of the theory, in particular about the extrapolating from the present to the past, would indicate, at the very least, that fossils don't seem to offer the strength of support that neo-Darwinian folks are using. And so basically, if you just kind of sum it all up, macroevolution is, to say the least, not unequivocally in the category to which Dennett and Dawkins and Lewontin are saying it is. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's literally not, evidence goes to the contrary. And to put an unobservable, unrepeatable phenomena in the same category as an observable and repeatable one would seem to be either an elementary blunder or a malicious exchange. And you kind of wonder if the reason for that is that fear of a divine footprint, which is playing a role in making that change. And so, when we start to go forward, let me make sure I don't miss this here. All right, here we go. There's a tiny bit more. So, by this stage, if not sooner, we should be accused of failing to take into account the biggest, most obvious objection. And so he's going to get into DNA sequences. And we don't have a lot of time to get into it, but Sophisticated computational methods for comparing the structure of the DNA sequences in a collection of organisms have shown a remarkable correspondence between genomes, with long stretches of DNA in different organisms being nearly identical. It is argued that this research, which proceeds quite independently of the fossil record or comparative anatomy, demonstrates without a doubt the intimate genetic relatedness of all living things, and it enables us to place them on common ancestral tree. This stunning triumph of molecular biology is claimed to form the most overwhelming evidence for the truth of neo-Darwinian synthesis. In other words, they say, look how similar everyone is from DNA. You'll hear questions like, look how we're at like 96% the same genetic code as a pig. Anyone heard that before? Yeah, okay. However, if there's any truth to what we've been considering so far in the chapter, the last statement goes way beyond the evidence. It's one thing to say that there's genetic relatedness, and it's entirely another claim that mutation and natural selection are the only mechanisms involved in production of that relatedness. Putting it another way, the neo-Darwinian synthesis cannot bear, again, the genetic weight that's put upon it. Something more is needed, and that something more is an input from a designing intelligence. But it's also it's worth making a couple remarks about this. The simple fact that species can be classified hierarchically into genera, families, and so on is not an argument for evolution. It's possible to classify any set of objects into a hierarchy, whether the variation is evolutionary or not. For example, cars can be arranged in a hierarchy, but all cars have similar parts because those parts are essential for their operation and because they are constructed according to a common design, not because they've descended from each other. Do you guys all follow what I'm saying? Like if you go to the Lego store, you don't think that the dragon Lego evolved from the little house Lego. Like, whoa, that's evolution. You're like, no. Have you ever thought that the Lego building blocks can be put together differently by an intelligent designer? It's the whole point of Lego. It's the whole point of DNA. Again, similarities in DNA sequences could therefore logically equally be well read as evidence of common design, not evolution. The data is the data is the data. So, postulating an unobserved designer is no more unscientific than postulating an unobserved macroevolutionary steps. And it's surely very evident that the evolution of the gaps is at least as widespread as the God of the gaps. And that's kind of my point all along. And so let me take you to my paper I wrote tonight. It's short, should be fine. Anyone actually read these? Looked them up? A couple of you? Okay, that's cool. I guess I'll keep writing them. They're available. If no hands went up, I'd take them all out of spite off the website. Just out of spite. But this takes me a while to think through. So here's what's motivated me to write. So what I'm trying to do is take what Lennox is saying, and I'm trying to take Francis Schaeffer. And I'm trying to think, if I'm, the way Schaeffer presses the implications, what do you do with what you just heard? Does it make sense? And so here's a brief thing. What did I write? I called it micro, macro, and the weight that they cannot bear, something like that. I don't know. It's on their site. On the teaching. Okay, ready? Here it is. A common move in popular level debates about evolution is the quiet slide from microevolution to macroevolution. Not by demonstrating a mechanism, but by treating them as if they're simply the same thing. Microevolution, again, refers to observable variation and adaptation within limits, shifts in gene frequency, natural selection, operating on existing information, finch beaks adjusting, bacteria developing resistance. These are real, measurable, repeatable phenomena. Christians have rarely needed to deny them because they fit easily within a doctrine of creation that includes creaturely flexibility. And again, Noah on the ark did not need to take in every kind of cat. He could just take in a cat. He did not need to take in every kind of bird. Just need to take a few. Does that make sense? And birds can go, all the family birds. Okay. But macroevolution is not merely microevolution plus time. It is the claim that these small-scale changes can account for the arrival of entirely new biological structures, new body parts, new body plans, new kinds. Ultimately, the whole story from molecules to man, they're saying, can be accounted for this mechanism. And the key point is this: the argument is often made rhetorically rather than scientifically. The move goes like this: we observe microevolution, therefore macroevolution is established. And to question macroevolution is to deny science. We've all heard that. But notice what happened. The actual question, how do you get from adaptation within a kind to the origin of entirely new kinds? It's never answered. Instead, the terms are merely collapsed. Micro is used as a stand-in, a placeholder, and a rhetorical bridge. It's not a demonstration, it's a definition by insistence. In that sense, it becomes an evolution of the gaps argument. How did we get there? Abracadabra did it. Evolution did it. Just as someone once said, God must fill the gaps we cannot explain, so now the materialist is saying evolution must fill the gaps we cannot explain. The unknown mechanism is assumed, not shown. The missing causal account is waved away with confidence and vocabulary. The gaps are not empty, they're simply occupied by an assertion. Abracadabra, evolution. And this is why the position, I affirm microevolution, but I'm not persuaded by macroevolution, is not obviously irrational, nor is it unscientific. In any other field, it would be an entirely reasonable thing to say, I accept small-scale observations. I remain unconvinced about the large-scale extrapolation you're making. Show me the mechanism, not just the label, please. But in the same way we dealt with this during the climate issue, if you said, hey, I'm kind of curious, like how much anthropogenic climate is caused, like how much is that affected by this? I'm just not sure the mechanism. The argument isn't, well, let's answer that, or I understand what part you're dealing with. It's, you're a climate denier. Well, that's the language of heresy, and this has been the language of evolution for a long time. Why does this stance so often provoke heat? Why does it produce bluster? Because the intensity frequently reveals that more than biology is at stake. And we know this, but the person speaking to you needs to know this. Worldviews are at play. If macroevolution must be true, not merely as a scientific model, but as a metaphysical necessity, then questioning it feels like threatening the whole roof of their worldview. Right? That's the kind of point. And this is where Francis Schaeffer helps us. As I mentioned, Schaeffer urged Christians not to be intimidated by scientific bravado, but also not to argue with arrogance. If you don't know something, don't pretend you know it. One of my favorite things about this silly podcast is if Brett asks me something, I'm like, I don't know. He asked me the other day, do you think that aliens are the Bible? Are they demons? And like, I don't know. Here's what I'll tell you what I think, but I don't know. I don't know is a great answer. We don't have to be crazy. On the flip side, our view is very modest. And you know a lot more than you realize, right? Our task isn't to shout louder, but to ask honest questions that expose presuppositions. And remember, our presuppositions comport with reality. Theirs don't. What do I mean by that? We should not argue immodestly as if we ourselves know everything. Rather, we should gently require that the other side makes its own immodest claim. Let them speak. So instead of being pressured into saying evolution explains nothing, which is an assertion, right? We can calmly ask, if I accept microevolution, help me understand why it's unscientific to question macroevolution. Boy, that's a bomb. How about this one? Could you maybe show me the demonstrated mechanism that's crossing those boundaries? I'm just having a hard time seeing why you would be so confident. Or how about this one? Why does this conversation get so emotional for you? I thought we're talking about science. It should be like fun. We're looking at the same data set. I'm asking some questions. That kind of question doesn't deny data. It's just denying intimidation. And it reminds us that often the heat in the room is not coming from the laboratory or the data, but from the deeper commitments underneath, driving the lenses that are viewing it. This is where any honest conversation ought to begin. To say things appear designed because they are designed is not somehow less scientific than saying things appear designed because an undirected process is capable of bearing the entire creative weight of what we see. The question is not whether we're interpreting the data. The question is, which interpretation of data actually fits the data without borrowing from another worldview? And this is precisely the point. What often presents itself as pure science is, in fact, a metaphysical claim dressed in scientific language. And this is why the real debate is not first about fossils or finches. It is about foundations. It's about the rules of the game. And here's the fun part. Once it's admitted, the discussion becomes clearer and more honest. What do I mean? Once you get someone to say, hey, I'll accept microevolution, we can both agree on that. I think the debate is more about macroevolution. I assume you're willing to concede that this is something that you're saying makes sense of the data. You say this is your theory. You don't have data for macroevolution. You're saying this is your explanation of the data. Is that fair? And they're saying, yes. I'm like, okay, my explanation of the data is that it makes sense because of the designer. But here's the point of that. Now all of a sudden we're both playing soccer. We're not saying, you're playing volleyball and I'm playing golf, and I hit it and you're like, that's out. And I'm like, goal. Like, that's what's happening when we normally converse. Once you get to that place, every apologetics goal, what we're trying to do is like in the Bible where Elijah and the prophets of Baal had the confrontation. The key in that confrontation was that even though they vastly disagreed, they were communicating more than we often are in our conversations because of this. They both were saying, which God is true, not what does the word true mean. So they said, let's have a test, and they both agreed to the game. you basically make your thing and call down fire, and I'll make mine and call down fire. And whichever. So notice they created the venue. What we're trying to do in apologetics is get people to the table and say, you put your worldview down, I'll put my worldview down, and let's see which one matches reality. That's the goal. Because here's again, once we get to that goal, there's only one view that matches reality. And I'm saying this with confidence, and I say this with absolute confidence. And if there's not, let me know about it. Both positions involve faith. But which worldview best explains, which faith best explains the real world? Both positions, right? Faith in the sense of ultimate commitments. It can't be proven within the system itself through the lens that we're asserting. But the cost of which view we take is not the same. When we both put our things down on the table, if the evolutionist loses, their view loses, they say, well, I could pick either one. I'm like, you could. This one was going to cost you a lot if you're wrong. So I would imagine you'd want to at least examine this one. That's all we're saying, right? The Darwinian must live consistently with his assertions in the real world, that mind is accidental, that reason is chemical, that morality is adaptive, that meaning is imposed, and he cannot actually live that way. He has to smuggle in dignity and truth and obligation and purpose, realities that his system just can't account for. But the Christian, we do believe by faith. We believe by faith. We as a presupposition, a faith that these things are true, but our faith happens to correspond to the world as it is. An atheist can tell you they're moral, they just can't tell you why. You should be also. We can account for this, right? We can explain why humans reason, why conscience accuses, why beauty moves us, why evil horrifies us, why people act the way we do. Our presupposition seems to be a better job explaining things. In other words, Christianity doesn't just merely survive contact with reality, it actually makes sense of it. But Christianity does more than explain, and this is where the danger is always felt. It also calls. Christianity, the idea that there's a creation in these things, is a call to repent of the autonomy that we claim and to bow before the one who designed what we're still trying to explain away. We have to know how to get to that place. It starts with modesty, with breaking down presuppositions and getting to the table where you both put your cards on the table. And Christian, I don't want to go past this, but my poker analogy, I'm going to use it again. I don't play a lot of poker, but some of you know poker. And in the game of Texas Hold'em, let's say, if you get pocket aces, you get two aces, and they put down, I don't know what you're talking about, Matt. Okay, well, go look up prescient and then look up Texas Hold'em. If you get a good hand, and right away, you get a good hand. And then they put down the three cards, and it's two more aces, okay? Let's say, or it's like a royal flush or full house. What's the best one? Royal flush? Full house? Whatever. One of the royal full house flush, okay? You have the best hand. Do you go all in or not? Do you put all your money in? Do you go all in? No. Ready? Here's why. Hey, we're playing poker, and all of a sudden I get a hand like, all in. What are you going to do if your hand's like pretty good but okay? You're going to be like, I got fold. And that's what's happening in all your conversations. You're at the barbershop. Hey, I'm just not sure. I'm like, okay, all in. Oh, yeah. Do you have any meaning? Like, I'm just not really interested in talking to you. But instead, if you're like, oh, no. Like, I'm going to check the bet. Oh, yeah, I'll just bet a little bit. You want to invite them. What we're trying to do is get them to bring their worldview to the table. And once they've been putting the chips in and then putting the money in, once they're committing themselves, they're no longer jello, then you say, all in. And you start to say, so if you found out that your view doesn't comport with reality, would you still hold to it? If you found out the Bible isn't full of the contradictions you think it is, would you believe it? Wow, there's stakes, there's money in now mentally, if you get my analogy. I don't know, do that what you want, let's pray. God, thank you so much for tonight. I ask that you'd help us to use these terms. Help us to, first of all, make us not so scared about the subject. Help us to be modest, but have clarity. And we just pray for those that don't believe in you because of the smoke screen of a metaphysical view wearing a lab coat. I pray that you would help us have enough compassion to not be afraid of the guy with the English accent that says these things. That we recognize that we all need you and that true wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. We know that your gospel is effective, that we don't need to make the gospel not seem foolish because it is truly a foolish gospel that saves. But Father, help us to get people to the place where they're willing to hear the foolish gospel. Thank you so much in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you next week.